Today we're going to go over the last 3 data points that I want to hit in the book of Acts on the risks that the original alleged witnesses to Jesus' resurrection took. That they really were, according to Acts, what we gained from Acts, risking their lives for what they were attesting. In passing, I used that word alleged witnesses there. Last Friday I was briefly involved in a stream concerning undesigned coincidences and some criticisms against my work on undesigned coincidences, and one of the people to whom we were responding was a Dr. Jeff Tripp, who quoted me from Hidden in Plain View, referring to alleged discrepancies, I think it was, or alleged contradictions, and paused in the middle of reading that. He paused to say, because they can't be real contradictions, which is a complete misinterpretation. And you'll notice that I throw the word alleged in other places, like just here I threw it in alleged witnesses to the resurrection. Obviously, I think that they were real witnesses, so why did I put in the word alleged? Well, because we're talking about the argument for the resurrection. So, in that context, we express it in a neutral way. They're the alleged witnesses. Now let's see what they risked. Same way in which I talked about alleged discrepancies. The point I was making in the context did not turn on whether they were real discrepancies or not. So that's by the way. The last 3 data points I want to focus on from the book of Acts are the stoning of Stephen, the persecution by Saul of Tarsus and how this affected the apostles specifically. And then the third one is the persecution in chapter 12 by Herod Agrippa I, which involved the actual martyrdom of James, the son of Zebedee. Okay, so stoning of Stephen, the story of that begins in Acts 6 at the end. Now, Stephen is a deacon, so he may not have even claimed to have met the risen Jesus. We don't know what relationship he had, if any, to Jesus during Jesus' lifetime, and we don't have any direct evidence that he claimed to be a witness of the resurrected Jesus. And so it might be easy to just kind of pass on by this and say, you know, this is irrelevant. But not so fast. So the story is that he's angering the religious leaders and they have him arrested, and there are false witnesses saying that he's committed blasphemy. And then in chapter 7, he gives this big long sermon ending in a very, angry, provocative way about killing the prophets and so forth. And so then the leaders are angry and they grab him along with a mob, and they drag him outside, and he's stoned to death. Okay? Now, it's really easy to think of ways to dismiss things like this without really digging into their evidential value. So, A, he doesn't claim to have witnessed Jesus' resurrection himself. B, he's killed by a mob. And, that's something that you'll hear sometimes from skeptics dismissing the persecution. Well, this isn't persecution because it's really a lynching. He's killed by a mob. But when we're considering the impact upon the apostles who are there in Jerusalem leading the church, and the way this reflects upon their courage and what they are risking, I think we need to go deeper. So just use your imagination. There have been times, horribly, in history, all around the world, in the United States, there still are in other countries, where disfavored groups, whether disfavored racially or religiously, are subject to mob violence, and the authorities don't protect them. They're not protected, and nothing really happens to the people who kill them. It would be not only insensitive, but also foolish to say that if a member of such a minority group is lynched and nothing happens, that other members of that group have no reason to be afraid because he was lynched. What? Okay? They're all in danger at that point. And the resemblances to what happened to Jesus in what happened to Stephen are clear too. There's, witnesses saying that he's a blasphemer, he's dragged before the religious leaders, they're approving of his death. Okay? So it's like, yes, partially a lynching, but also quasi-official, because he's actually brought to the council, and the council then are like, kill him! And he's taken out and he's stoned. Remember, this is what they were considering doing to the apostles in chapter 5. We discussed that last time. Right? They have the apostles in, the apostles make them angry. It's probably Peter, John, and some larger group of the 12, possibly all of the 12. And they're like, let's kill him. Okay? And Gamaliel calms them down. But here, when they say about Stephen, let's kill him, they do kill him. Okay? So, if you were, I don't know, Thaddeus, some random member of the 12, not a prominent one, would you be in danger? Would you think that you were in danger? Yes, and rightly and reasonably so. You would be foolish to say to yourself, well, I know they were thinking of killing us before, and I know they've actually killed him, but it's a lynching. It's only semi-official. It's not absolutely systematic, so it doesn't endanger us at all. That would be dumb. Okay, so, but the apostles continued to be in charge. They continued to be steadfast. And that brings me to my next data point. All right. If you know the story of Paul, you know that he was present at the stoning of Stephen to death, and he actually held the clothes of the people, and he was in hearty agreement, says Acts 8:1. Saul was in hearty agreement with putting him to death. And on that day, a great persecution arose against the church in Jerusalem. Okay, so far from this being an isolated incident, and then they're like, oh, we won't do any more persecuting stuff. We kind of got that out of our system or something. No, this isn't an isolated incident. This is actually just the beginning of a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem. It specifically mentions the church in Jerusalem. And then it says, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. All right, so now I don't believe that the author of Acts is blaming the Christians who scattered. In fact, it says in verse 4, therefore those who had been scattered went about preaching the word. And then it starts telling some stories about Philip the deacon. This isn't Philip, one of the 12. It's a different Philip who was one of the deacons. And so it's not like, yeah, they were bad that they scattered. In fact, it's sort of regarded as a thing that had its point, because then the message of the Christians was carried to a wider geographical area. But the apostles seem to have believed that it was their job to stay in Jerusalem. And I think the very fact that Philip, the deacon, who's kind of this next tier of leaders, he leaves and goes to Samaria, but the apostles stay in Jerusalem, shows that we're still talking about a fairly restrictive concept of the apostles, like it's been, and I've been demonstrating in these early chapters of Acts, that it's this core leadership group of those who were witnesses of Jesus' resurrection. It's not that they took some kind of vow never, ever, ever to leave Jerusalem. In fact, I think eventually they did go other places. But that at this time, they still thought they really needed to stay and lead what you might call the mother church in Jerusalem. And I think that's indicated. verse 3, dodging back here, 8:3, but Saul began ravaging the church, entering house after house, and dragging off men and women. He would put them in prison. So, are the Romans protecting the Christians? Answer, no. Okay, so apparently this is being treated as lying within the jurisdiction of that sort of, quasi-police power that the agents of the Sanhedrin have in that area. And so Paul is going out there, and he's even getting people other than the core apostles. He's getting even women. So if you had thought that maybe being a woman was protective, nobody's going to go after you, that's not true anymore. You're at least going to be thrown in prison. And as we've seen, beating was definitely considered, no problem. We're not going to get in any trouble with the Roman authorities if we beat people. Now, I'm not saying that it names, Mary Magdalene or, the other Mary or any of the others who are named in the Gospels as having gone to the empty tomb. But if they're in Jerusalem at this time, as they well may be, or in any of the areas that Paul is persecuting when he's Saul of Tarsus, they certainly could have been persecuted. So, the net is cast widely enough that anybody who is a Christian is at some risk, and that those who are, prominent, who are known, are at even more risk. So this is relevant. It's very relevant, and it's brave of the 12 to remain in Jerusalem, and I believe that's what it's saying here in 8:1. Okay. Now it goes on, and we've got the account of Paul's conversion, and we start getting stories about Paul. A lot of Acts is focused on Paul, and I think the author was a friend and companion of Paul. But even so, you can go on for a few chapters, and you get to the final data point that I'm going to consider in this series in Acts 12. Acts 12:1. Now about that time, Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them. And he had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. Now this Herod, this is Agrippa I. So it's not Antipas from the lifetime of Jesus, and it's not Herod the Great from the infancy of Jesus. It's Agrippa I, who, by the way, did style himself king. We have coins in which he was called King Basileus. And that's just another of these little marks of accuracy, because Antipas was a tetrarch. He didn't call himself Basileus. But this guy did. Now, we see a person actually killed. So this is someone who is one of the 12. And it's not just Peter and John. It's not just the Peter and John show, right? It's James, the son of Zebedee, who is actually killed by the sword. Beheaded, presumably. Okay? So those leaders are still in the crosshairs. And it follows a similar kind of pattern to the killing of Jesus, in that you have a higher authority who realizes that this is gonna please a certain section, a powerful section of those that he's ruling over, and so he's like, hey, let's do that, okay? And it specifically says, laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them. Mistreat, kind of a little bit of a euphemism, but he actually has James, the son of Zebedee, killed, and then arrests Peter. By this time, we're sort of used to Peter getting arrested. I think I've lost count. What is this, the 4th time Peter's been arrested in the book of Acts? Okay, so, and the Christians are so afraid that when Peter gets out, they're like, they've got the door locked, and the door girl goes to the door, and she doesn't want to let Peter in. She's afraid it might be his ghost, and all of this. So there's definitely still an atmosphere of fear and persecution, particularly of those who are the leaders. Now, I heard someone recently saying that this doesn't really count as a persecution. I don't even know the reasons why, but this leads me to a comment I want to make about skeptical approaches to church persecutions. You'll find again and again that there's a kind of a misdirection that takes place. It doesn't count as a persecution unless, and then they'll make up some completely, invented criteria. So it had to be empire-wide. Why? Okay, where are the apostles? They're in Jerusalem. The people we're saying are risking their lives. Okay, if it's dangerous in Jerusalem and they're in Jerusalem, that's relevant to the fact that they're risking their lives, or this is a favorite one of mine that you'll hear skeptics say, unless we have an actual record of a trial where someone who claimed to be a witness to Jesus' resurrection was told, you will be released if you recant your claim that you saw the resurrected Jesus, and the person says, I will not recant my claim, and then they're killed. If we don't have that exact sequence, then it doesn't count. I mean, it's ridiculous. We have things very similar to that we've read over the last few weeks. They're dragged before the rulers, and they're like, we ought to obey God rather than men. We can't stop telling what we have heard and seen. It's like, do what you're going to do, but we're going to keep on preaching, okay? But it'll be, something will be made up. Or to go back to the Gospels, where it says in John 9 that it was said that if anyone confessed that Jesus was the Messiah, he would be thrown out of the synagogue, right? And the parents of the man born blind, they're kind of nervous, and they just say, talk to him, don't talk to us. And the skeptics will come along and say, there was no declaration throughout the entire Jewish world officially that anyone who was a Christian was to be thrown out of the synagogue at this time. So this couldn't really have happened. Where does the phrase throughout the Jewish world come in there? Right? I mean, in the text of John, it's talking about something that the leaders there in Jerusalem are saying, insofar as anybody's listening to them, and some people would. The healing takes place in Jerusalem, okay? And these parents of the man born blind, they don't want to be ostracized. Very serious matter. They don't want to lose their whole social network. That would have economic implications and everything. So, let's not set up this artificial claim and sort of knock it down and then say, therefore, there was no relevant persecution. Therefore, they weren't really risking their lives. That allows the dismissal of very pertinent evidence of boldness, courage on the part of the original alleged witnesses that we really ought to be taking into account. We really ought to be considering in detail. So, for these last several weeks, what I've given you is what you can say from the book of Acts. So if anyone tries to say to you, even if we took Acts at face value, we don't get from there that they were out in public, loudly proclaiming that they had seen Jesus risen from the dead. We don't know who these apostles were, and we don't have evidence that they were all out there doing this as opposed to some of them just sort of quietly, slinking away. Actually, we do. So I've tried to give this in great detail, and at this point, those claims should really be demolished. Come back next time to find out what we're going to do next here at the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.